Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I will be joined by a series of my colleagues who are coming to the floor this afternoon to talk about the November 2018 elections coming up and the steps that we need to take to make sure that the Russian influence effort that bedeviled our 2016 election is not replicated in the 2018 election. I guess the first question to answer is this a realistic prospect? Is this something we should concern ourselves with, that the Russians would come back again in 2018 and try to meddle in our elections? Everybody in the Trump administration who has been asked about this, perhaps outside of the Oval Office itself, has said yes, absolutely, they're coming. The director of the CIA, the director of national intelligence, the head of the FBI, the Attorney General, the Department of Justice. There is no contest, there is no disagreement, there is no doubt, even among the President's senior national security and law enforcement team, that they're coming back, that they're going to do this again. So that leads us to the question of what we're doing about it. And it seems that, A, the silence from the Oval Office on this subject is deafening. The White House doesn't ever want to talk about doing anything about this. And to the extent that we get signals from tweets and things like that, they're usually non-factual and highly politicized challenges to the basic facts that all of the President's senior staff seem to agree with, senior cabinet staff. So I don't know why they haven't sorted out why the President says one thing and all of his cabinet officials say something else, but that's for them. What's for us is to review this in Congress, to do oversight, and to do what legislation might be necessary to raise our defenses, to make sure that we can effectively counter what we have been warned is coming at us. We have no proposal from the administration. You would think with something like this that we have an election that has been attacked by a hostile foreign country. You'd think that would be the kind of thing that would bring our country together, that would get the President's attention. He swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and last I heard, the elections are a part of our Constitution, and yet, nothing. Crickets. Where's the proposal? Where are the congressional hearings on our proposals? Where are the markups? Where are the bills? We're seeing an extraordinary lack of interest and initiative in something about which we have been very, very forcefully warned. The failure at the White House is very profound. Over and over again, we have heard senior Trump officials say that they have not been instructed by the President to take this seriously. My senior colleague, Senator Jack Reed, asked Director Chris Wray of the FBI about whether the FBI had taken specific actions to confront and blunt Russian influence and disinformation activities. And on February 13th, in the Senate Intelligence Committee, he said, not as specifically directed by the President, no. To read the transcript more completely, Senator Reed asked, so let me begin with Mr. Wray and say, has the President directed you and your agency to take specific actions to confront and blunt Russian influence activities that are ongoing? Wray, we're taking a lot of specific efforts to blunt Russian directed by the president, Senator Reid asked. The director replied, not as specifically directed by the president, no. Similarly, 2 weeks later, on February 27th, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the NSA's director, Admiral Mike Rogers, said that he had not been granted new authority nor directed specifically by the president to take action to disrupt Russian election hacking operations. Again, Senator Reid asked, so you would need basically to be directed by the president through the Secretary of Defense to get, Rogers interrupts, yes, sir, as I mentioned that in my statement. Senator Reid continued, have you been directed to do so, given the strategic threat that faces the United States and the significant consequences you recognize already? Admiral Rogers, no, I have not. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. You can add also to this list of failures of activity the State Department, which was allocated $120 million to counter foreign efforts to meddle in elections or sow distrust in democracy. According to a March 4th story in the New York Times, and I'll quote it here, there has been no effort, well, here's the quote, not one of the 23 analysts working in the department's Global Engagement Center, which has been tasked with countering Moscow's disinformation campaign, speaks Russian. And a department hiring freeze has hindered efforts to recruit the computer experts needed to track the Russian efforts. So when Congress provides $120 million to the State Department to take steps to protect against Russian election interference, what we get back is none of that money gets spent, and a hiring freeze prevents the people with the necessary qualifications for even coming in to do the job. That is not taking the problem seriously, not at the FBI, not at the NSA, not at the State Department. As far as I can tell, there actually is no formal executive branch interagency process that is designed to examine what the Russians did and put together legislative recommendations for Congress to follow up on. In national security matters, that's the president's role. That's the executive branch's role. We have the authority to make the laws, but because they're doing the day-to-day work, we count on the executive branch to put the proposals together for us. And again, nothing. There is one thing that we did do. There is one thing that we did do. We wanted to send a strong signal to Vladimir Putin that there was a price to be paid for this kind of misbehavior manipulating our elections. And virtually unanimously, in this chamber, 98-2, I don't know the numbers on the House side, but it was equally virtually unanimous on the House side. But it was 98-2 here in the Senate. We passed tough sanctions to hit Vladimir Putin where it hurts, which is right in the oligarchs. That's what he cares about. The oligarchs that support him, the oligarchs whose corrupt enterprises he is corruptly engaged with, that whole racketeering enterprise that runs the Russian government is what the sanctions would go after. Well, the administration has refused to implement them. The State Department has said they're not needed. Not needed. We're hearing from all the Trump administration's own senior executive agencies that they're going to come and do this again in 2018. How are they not needed if this is no deterrence for what they did in 2016? It would be one thing to say they were not needed if the evidence was, okay, they got the message, they're not going to do this again, we're fine in 2018. But that's not what Trump's own cabinet officials and national intelligence leaders are telling us. They're telling us they are needed because they're coming at us again. So this added bit of deterrence would be really, really important. When it came to something as simple as putting together the list of targeted oligarchs to put maximum pressure on President Putin? They didn't even put a list together on their own. They went to Forbes magazine and took the list out of a public magazine. That doesn't look like a serious or conscientious effort. So right up and down the administration, you see failure to take this seriously, traceable directly to the White House. And that is very, very regrettable. The other thing that we don't know is what the White House has been up to with respect to Congress. There was a lot of talk early on about how we needed to have an independent committee to take a look at this, to be independent, to put a package of reforms and observations and recommendations together, and we've had no support for doing that. What we were told was, don't worry, work through the committees. Well, the committees aren't doing much, to tell you the truth. It's like the gavels are made out of foam rubber around here. We could do a lot better, and there is no independent commission, and it raises the question, what was the role of the White House? What was the role of the president in stopping an independent commission? How active were they in doing that? Those are questions that need answers, but obviously, if there aren't serious investigative processes going on in our committee, it's hard to get those answers. Here's another question. What was the role of the White House in coordinating or colluding with the House Intelligence Committee, with Representative Nunes and/or his staff in the preparation of the so-called Nunes memo? We've learned a lot about that memo since it came out. We've learned that it was essentially phony. It had a couple of basic accusations. One was the FBI had misled the FISA court. They hadn't disclosed to them that one of the sources that supported the affidavit that got the FISA warrant for the surveillance of Carter Page, that one of those sources had been in touch with or been funded by a political campaign. That this was a phony effort cooked up on behalf of the Clinton campaign and run before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Well, as it turns out, the FISA application stated specifically the FBI's speculation that Steele had been hired, the source had been hired to, quote, find information that could be used to discredit candidate number one's campaign, Trump's campaign. As somebody who's pursued affidavits for search warrants and for surveillance warrants before, I can tell you that it's common and standard FBI and Department of Justice practice to leave out unnecessary names. So the fact that Mrs. Clinton wasn't mentioned is perfectly consistent with longstanding department practice. The other thing that it omitted was that the Steele information was actually corroborating information for a lot of other information that had begun this investigation beforehand. So that theory that this all depended on this particular source and that this source had an undisclosed relationship with a political opponent was simply baloney. The fact of the matter was that that was disclosed in the warrant, and there were additional sources. So that takes you to the question of why. Why would a legislative committee, apparently deliberately, put together a report that contained misleading or false statements, that tried to create an erroneous and false impression about something that had taken place? Well, did the White House have any connections in that process? That's the question that we're entitled to answers on. Because if this was just a botched job by a partisan crew in a legislative committee, that's one set of problems. If this is the Congress of the United States taking its oversight authority and handing it over to the executive branch of government, handing it over to White House operatives when the White House itself is the subject of the inquiry, that is a very different problem. And we are owed an answer as to what the communications were between the White House and the Trump legal team and the staff at the House Intelligence Committee who prepared the Nunes report. I've been joined by the distinguished senator from Connecticut, so I will leave my remarks there and yield the floor.
Senator from Connecticut.
Because our country is under attack. In fact, we are here because Russia is attacking our democracy as part of a campaign of informational warfare. That term is not mine. It is Russia's. It is quoted in an indictment that was handed down by the special counsel less than a month ago against 13 individuals and 3 entities. That document is absolutely stunning. It is chilling in its detail and breadth, in its revelations about the apparatus and personnel, the skills and expertise that Russia brought to bear methodically and relentlessly in the 2016 election in its attack on our democracy. That attack began in 2014. It was not a few hackers in the basement of some Moscow apartment. It was literally thousands of people divided into different departments with different skills, pursuing disinformation, cyber attack, misinformation, propaganda directed at undermining our democracy and, in fact, our elections. Let's remember, constitutionally, elections are foundational to our democracy. And Russia sought not just to sow discord and dissension, but to affect the outcome. According to the indictment, its effort to affect the outcome was to assist then candidate Donald Trump and to disparage and damage Hillary Clinton. We will never know how much it affected the outcome, but it certainly impacted the views and the votes of some people in the United States of America. That attack now is continuing. Our intelligence community is unanimous in the view that Russia interfered in our last election and that that effort is continuing. Indeed, all of the intelligence community that has come before the Armed Services Committee in the last 2 weeks has been unanimous in that view. Russia is continuing its attack. And Admiral Rogers, in his testimony, was very clear that they will continue that attack because they are paying no price for it. The cost to them is minimal, if any, and the benefit is highly asymmetrical. In other words, they pay very little to undermine our democracy. They see a lot of return. And that is because this country is doing little or nothing, or I should say more accurately, this administration is doing absolutely nothing to make Russia pay a price. And that is the testimony, in effect, from representatives of the intelligence community, including, most recently today, the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, and General Robert Ashley. When I asked what was being done to deter, counter, or retaliate against the Russians, Director Coates said, in effect, it is everyone's responsibility, which means, in effect, it is no one's responsibility, that it was the whole of government responding, which means no single agency, and there is no plan and no action underway. There is at most, perhaps, some kind of study of what should be done. But the denial of meddling is really the reason why nothing has been done and why no action is underway. And that denial comes from one person, the President of the United States. He has refused to acknowledge that the Russians interfered on the scale with the scope that they did, and that denial or refusal to acknowledge is itself a tremendous boon to the Russians in continuing to attack our democracy. As recently as this afternoon, at his press conference with the Swedish Prime Minister, the President said, in effect, well, perhaps Russia might have meddled, other countries might have meddled, other individuals might have meddled, but he has refused to acknowledge the extent and the depth and breadth of past and continuing Russian interference in our democracy. Make no mistake, others of us on both sides of the aisle have said it. The Russians will escalate in the sophistication of their attacks, in the depth of their interference, in the type of tools used through cyber and social media and platforms as yet being developed. And they will use American voices, no longer the broken English, no longer the payment in rubles. They will become ever more astute and adroit in this attack on our democracy. So the question is why? Why has the President declined to acknowledge this attack, a continuing assault on our democratic institutions, particularly on our elections, foundational to our democracy? Some have put it, what do the Russians have on him? But my view is that we need to look back at the knowledge that the Trump campaign had of that attack in 2016 as it was proceeding. And to take one example, the stolen or hacked emails. Clearly, Trump campaign contacts with WikiLeaks and Russia show that the campaign knew about those stolen or hacked emails, which were then used to attack the Clinton campaign. And if those members of the Trump campaign knew about it in responsible positions, the question is, how could the President not have known? In April of 2016, George Papadopoulos, a member of the Trump foreign policy team for at least a substantial period of time, was eager to communicate with senior staff of the Trump campaign that he knew that the Russians had hacked emails and that those emails could help the Trump campaign. He was anxious to ingratiate himself with his connections, to make himself more valuable in their eyes. And so he boasted, in effect, about his contacts with Russians and with Russian officials. Papadopoulos was already working overtime to ingratiate himself with the Trump campaign leadership, and he certainly was not likely to keep valuable information about stolen emails possessed by the Russians to himself. Remember, when the Trump campaign, specifically Donald Trump Jr., was offered dirt on Hillary Clinton, he replied, "I love it." From everything we know about Donald Trump Jr.'s relationship to his father, he is unlikely to have kept that information to himself. George Papadopoulos is one of several Trump associates who seemed to know that Russia was trying to help the Trump campaign win the 2016 election. Donald Trump Jr., again, was in contact with WikiLeaks beginning in September of 2016, and we know this communication continued at least through July of 2017. We know that Donald Trump Jr. turned over these messages to investigators. When Trump Jr. received the first message from WikiLeaks, he emailed other senior officers with the Trump campaign. And those officers included Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, Brad Parscale, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. How would that information not have been transmitted to Donald Trump himself? Donald Trump Jr. received an email in which WikiLeaks offered to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents that would supposedly incriminate Hillary Clinton. We know now that Donald Trump Jr. jumped at the chance to receive this information, responding to WikiLeaks with the famous, "If it's what you say, I love it." And that then led to the meeting involving Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort at Trump Tower. There is more here. Is the likelihood of collusion. There is a credible case of obstruction of justice against the President of the United States. There is solid factual basis to believe that the Trump campaign not only knew, but encouraged and cooperated and even colluded with the Russians in this effort. And if motive is necessary for the Trump campaign to have done this kind of collusion, certainly it was in the prospect of impacting the outcome. And if motive is necessary for President Trump now refusing to acknowledge Russian meddling during the election campaign and now continuing meddling, it is that collusion as well. So we are in a dangerous time because, in fact, Russia will continue to interfere and undermine our democracy if it pays no price for it. And the only way to make sure that Russia will pay a price to counter, deter, or retaliate is for the President of the United States to demonstrate leadership and to put aside whatever concern about legitimacy there may be No one is relitigating the 2016 election as to what the outcome was. In fact, we have a president in office, but that president now must act to protect our democracies and our elections going forward from this day into the future. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor to my distinguished colleague from Illinois.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague from Connecticut as well as my colleague from Rhode Island for calling us together on the floor of the Senate today to discuss a timely and important topic. Mr. President, we know that Vladimir Putin and Russia attacked America's democracy in 2016, and it's clear that Vladimir Putin will try again. CIA Director Pompeo recently said that he had, quote, every expectation Russia would try to influence our 2018 midterm election. We've been warned. We can expect Russia to continue to use the tactics they've used before and to come up with new ones. We can expect them to hack and leak sensitive information. We can expect these Russians to use social media and propaganda to spread false information. We see it almost every week. We can expect them to try to hack into state election systems and more. Mr. President, I was home over the weekend in Springfield, Illinois, of course the state capital, and ran into a fellow who works for the State Board of Elections. We talked for a few minutes about the experience we had in our state in the last election cycle when the Russians hacked into the computer network of the Illinois State Board of Elections. We were the only state of those that were hacked to come forward and identify the culprit. It was Russia. We also came forward and notified hundreds of thousands of our voters that their identity, at least in terms of the state election agency is concerned, had been compromised by the Russians. We were open about it. I asked the individual what was being done for the next election cycle, and he said we've patched the problem that gave the Russians entry into the system in 2016, and we spent over $100,000 as a state to put in new security, new cyber protection. We're taking it seriously in Illinois because we know what the Russians tried to do to us. We don't believe that they changed a vote or changed a ballot, but we're not sure they won't try in the future. That's the reality of what we face in Illinois. That's the reality of what America faces. Just last week, NSA and U.S. Cyber Command head Admiral Mike Rogers bluntly acknowledged what most of us already know. President Trump is doing nothing to protect Illinois or any other state against Russia's ongoing and future attacks on our election process. In fact, President Trump reportedly refuses to even talk about the issue. Admiral Rogers told the Armed Services Committee that Vladimir Putin has paid, quote, little price for his previous and ongoing attacks and therefore hasn't been stopped. Incredibly, the Admiral said President Trump has not granted him any new authorities to strike at Russian cyber operations. Can anyone here imagine what President Ronald Reagan would have said at this stunning abdication of responsibility in addressing this Russian threat to America? In the face of this fundamental threat of Russian attack on our democracy, we should have spent the last year coming together on a bipartisan basis, establishing a sound national defense when it comes to the exercise of our democracy. We should be working, Republicans and Democrats together, to hold anyone accountable who participated in this Russian effort. We should be strengthening our laws against foreign election interference, a responsibility of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which has never even taken up that issue. And we should punish and deter Russia and other nations from ever attacking our democratic process again. Instead, we've seen the Trump administration consistently refuse to hold the Russians accountable for their election interference or impose meaningful sanctions. President Trump has even gone out of his way to invite top Russian officials to the Oval Office and to call Russians' election interference a, quote, hoax. Despite the fact that all of our intelligence agencies say that he is wrong, President Trump calls Russian election interference a hoax. So what are Republicans in Congress doing about this? With a few exceptions, like Senator John McCain, they've mostly tried to change the subject. In fact, instead of trying to get a full accounting of what Russia did to us, Republicans have focused far more on scrutinizing and criticizing anyone who suggests that the Russians interfered. Mr. President, we need to take a step back and remember what this is all about. Specifically, that a foreign adversary of the United States interfered in America's election. They continue to use weaponized cyber campaigns against us and our allies, and most in the majority party of Congress and the President seem not to care at all. How have we let it get to this point? Have we forgotten our obligation to our Constitution and to this country? For those who watched the devastating two-part episode of the PBS documentary Frontline last year, entitled Putin's Revenge, there was a telling moment. Months before the 2016 election, our nation's top intelligence officials came and told key congressional leaders about Russia's efforts. These intelligence officials were deeply concerned about what Russia was trying to do to the 2016 election. President Obama had wanted a bipartisan message condemning Putin for his efforts so it would avoid any hint of partisanship as we approached the election, and so that we could put a common face on this, a common sense of unity on this effort. What was the response of the Republican Party leadership after hearing this bombshell revelation by our intelligence agencies that this threat from Vladimir Putin actually goes to the heart of our democracy, the election process? The response of the Republican leader was, no thanks, we don't want to get involved, and they didn't. Is there anybody in the Senate, anybody who took the oath to protect the nation against enemies foreign and domestic, who thinks that any of us, regardless of political party, should get help from a foreign adversary to be elected? Yet here we are, with aggressive efforts to discredit investigations into this threat, with a White House that ignores Russian sanctions, with the majority party blocking legislation that offers aid to our states that request it to secure their election systems, with the failure of this Congress or this White House to do anything to protect against the next such threat. All the while, Russia continues to conduct disinformation campaigns right under our noses. On February 14th, the tragedy in Parkland, Florida, invited comments of those who wanted more gun safety and those who opposed it. And when we traced the source of many of the comments, we found out they were Russians. Russians preaching to the United States on both sides of the issue, trying to rile us up at this moment of great human tragedy. That is now commonplace. We need to wake up. Russian cyber campaigns were pushing for the release of the discredited Nunes memo from the House of Representatives. They have tried to undermine the FBI's credibility. They are at work every single day trying to undermine our democracy. Russian cyber campaigns have attacked even Republican senators who've been critical of President Trump. So I say to my Republican friends, not one of us is immune from these threats, and it's long overdue that we put nation before party in this extremely important matter. Next time it might be China or North Korea, taking different sides or pushing different agenda when it comes to the American political process. But of course it doesn't matter who a foreign adversary is trying to help. An attack on any American political party or democratic institution by any nation is an attack on all of us. At least it should be. This can't be tolerated. We don't want to make America great by letting foreign powers undermine it. So I ask my Republican friends, in fact, I invite them, join us to get to the bottom of this. Let's pass legislation together that helps requesting states secure their election systems. Let's pass legislation together that forces the administration, this one and future administrations, to protect our national infrastructure against these cyber threats. Let's work together on a bipartisan basis to ensure that Russia and others are genuinely deterred from such actions. Let's use sanctions when necessary and other measures. And let's work together to denounce the Russian disinformation campaign, regardless of who it might help on any given day. We have a lot of work to do, and we're only months away from this November election. In just 6 months or so, there'll be early voting in this election. Are the Russians going to get to vote? Maybe not directly, but indirectly. Will they be able to invade America's political machinery, election machinery? Will they make a difference in this next election campaign? Shame on us if we can't answer those questions, and shame on us if we do nothing to stop them. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I am stunned by President Trump's willful paralysis when it comes to holding Russia accountable about threats made crystal clear by our intelligence community. Indeed, it's been more than a year since 17 U.S. intelligence agencies issued their report on how the Kremlin sought to, and I quote, blend covert intelligence operations such as cyber activity with overt efforts by the Russian government agencies, state-funded media, third-party intermediaries, and paid social media users or trolls in order to undermine our 2016 elections. Today, even the administration's own national security strategy warns that Russia will continue to challenge American power, influence, and security interests at home and abroad. These threats are precisely why Congress imposed a mandate on President Trump to act. Yet time and again, this president has refused to hold Russia accountable and refuses to take steps to defend our democracy and our national security. It's alarming, it's reckless, and it's absolutely unacceptable. And to be honest, I also find it baffling. Here's why. Pick any policy issue. Chances are, since taking office, President Trump has changed his mind about it at least once. Last week, he changed his positions on gun safety so many times in 24 hours it could make your head spin. A few weeks before that, he rejected a bipartisan deal to protect Dreamers that met the very specifications he outlined to my colleagues and me just days before. And throughout the past year, the president's remarks with respect to NATO's Article 5, the alliance's bedrock principle which guarantees mutual defense, have been wholly inconsistent. But there's one thing that President Trump has shown rock-solid consistency on since taking office, and that is his shameful embrace of Russian President Vladimir Putin and his refusal to protect American democratic institutions. President Trump's embrace of Putin has put a straitjacket on U.S. policy towards Russia. In many ways, we're more vulnerable today than we were in 2016. Think about it. Mr. Putin made a serious gamble when he decided to interfere in our election, a gamble that would normally draw the ire of any American president, regardless of their political party. But as we know, nothing about this administration is normal. And the truth is, we are in far greater peril today because Mr. Putin knows that he has a friend in the White House, a friend who won't do anything to stop him from interfering in our democracy, nor those of our allies, a friend who won't even issue a statement condemning Putin's nuclear saber-rattling last week when he proudly showed a video simulating a nuclear attack on Florida. It's time for the president to recognize that Mr. Putin's intentions are not up for debate. From the spread of extremist propaganda across Europe to Russia's continued attack on Ukrainian sovereignty, to the latest revelations made public by Special Counsel Mueller's investigation, the Kremlin is orchestrating a systematic and ongoing campaign to undermine the democracies at the heart of the post-World War II international order. Consider President Trump's response to the revelations made public by Special Counsel Mueller when he indicted 13 Russians for interfering in our democracy 3 weeks ago. The special counsel's findings left many Americans shocked by Russia's outstanding, sophisticated effort to defraud American voters, stoke division on Facebook, and sow doubt in our electoral process in 2016. And yet, President Trump's only response to these stunning revelations of foreign interference? Nothing. Nothing. Not a word from the president beyond a victorious tweet once again proclaiming no collusion. At every turn, President Trump has dismissed the significance of Russia's interference in our elections. And his willful paralysis on Russia is in full display through the White House's refusal to impose sanctions under CAATSA, as well as the unacceptable delays in establishing a strategy for countering the Kremlin's propaganda and disinformation. Let's remember why Congress passed CAATSA in the first place, why the Senate voted 98-2 and the House of Representatives voted 419-3, despite overwhelming opposition from the Trump administration. We voted to hold Russia accountable for its assault on our democracy. And we voted to increase pressure on the Kremlin to stop its illegal war against our friends in Ukraine and its aiding and abetting of war crimes in Syria. But apparently, President Trump fails to see that these are real threats from a real foreign adversary. Real threats that undermine the integrity of our elections and therefore the security of our country. Real threats from a brutal leader who seeks the erosion of Western democracy as a strategic imperative for Russia's future. We saw it in March of 2014 when Russia authorized the use of military force to illegally occupy Crimea, blatantly violating the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people, violence that continues in eastern Ukraine to this day. We saw it in 2016 when the Kremlin's disinformation campaign targeted American voters on Facebook. We see it today as Russia continues to spread propaganda throughout Western Europe. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Russia continues to prop up Assad's brutal dictatorship, dropping bombs on hospitals and homes and humanitarian aid convoys working to help the Syrian people under siege. This president's schoolyard swagger stops cold when it comes to confronting the world's biggest bully, Vladimir Putin. It's been 7 months, since Congress passed the CAATSA sanctions law. And while the administration has upheld some sanctions imposed by Obama-era executive orders, it's appalling to see this White House refuse to implement sanctions that Congress made mandatory. Mandatory. Let me say that again. Provisions that were made mandatory. So let me tell you what I've learned about CAATSA's implementation in the recent briefings I've received as the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee and membership on the Banking Committee. President Trump has imposed no sanctions in response to Russia's cyber aggression as required by Section 224. President Trump has imposed no sanctions related to Russian crude oil products as required by Section 225. President Trump has imposed no sanctions on serious human rights abusers in the Russian Federation as required by Section 228. President Trump has imposed no sanctions on those facilitating the transfer of assets owned by the Russian people to oligarchs handpicked by Putin, as required under Section 233. President Trump has imposed no sanctions punishing Russia for its transfer of arms to Syria, as required under Section 234. And I could go on, but you get the picture. The Trump administration has refused to implement the law despite the overwhelming bipartisan will of Congress. A Congress that decided to put shall in that legislation versus may, which made it mandatory. The Constitution made Congress a co-equal branch of government for a reason, and I take very seriously our responsibility to hold the executive branch accountable. Given what we know about Russia's interference in European elections over the last year alone, I'm especially disappointed in the White House's failure to implement sanctions under Section 224. That section targets anyone knowingly undermining the cybersecurity of an individual or a democratic institution on behalf of the Russian government. I find it hard to believe this administration has yet to identify one single sanctionable offense. But in case they need some tips, here's two that they can look into. In November, Spain's government discovered Russia state-sponsored groups using social media to spread disinformation and influence political events in Catalonia. And just last week, the German government pointed to a massive cyber hack against its foreign ministry, allegedly carried out by a Russian state-sponsored group called Snake. Meanwhile, our intelligence leaders, including many who were appointed by President Trump himself, have testified that Russia continues to interfere here in the United States and looks forward to doing so during the midterm elections. Now, I've co-sponsored a resolution calling upon President Trump to implement these sanctions. And while we shouldn't have to pass a resolution calling on the administration to enforce the law we passed, which was mandatory, we clearly do. Fortunately, we have the opportunity to do so next week when the Foreign Relations Committee meets to mark up legislation. And I urge the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee to take up this important resolution. Let's remember that Congress also gave the administration additional tools to thwart Russia's disinformation campaigns, an essential priority if we want to protect the integrity of our democracy. Yet it seems that Russia's disinformation campaigns continue to sow chaos online unabated. Every day that ticks by is one that the Russian government continues to sharpen its tools and go on the attack. Every day that ticks by, the Russian government has further encroached on sovereign democracies. We saw it most recently when Russian trolls amplified right-wing hysteria over Congressman Devin Nunes's memo with the Twitter hashtag #ReleaseTheMemo. According to Politico, and I quote, Russian bots and their American allies gamed social media to put a flawed intelligence document atop the political agenda. And just this week, the New York Times reported on, quote, an American strategic void in response to Russian threats, highlighting the administration's inability to spend even $1 of the $120 million that Congress authorized over a year ago to counter the Kremlin's information warfare. The Defense Department last week transferred $40 million, a third of what was authorized, to the State Department's Global Engagement Center, though not a penny's worth of action has been taken. Why the ridiculous delay? Why not the full amount? Any responsible president would be vigorously working to protect Americans from foreign interference aimed at undermining our democracy. Any responsible president would have communicated to the American people the seriousness of the threat and rallied our citizens to respond with classic American resilience and courage. Any responsible president would have worked with Congress on a robust strategy and secured funding for it. And once he got the resources, any responsible president would have moved swiftly to spend it, to empower all the relevant security agencies to mobilize a collective effort to protect the integrity of our democracy. But we don't have a responsible president. We have a president asleep at the wheel, or maybe even too scared to get into the car at all. We cannot afford further delays that only cede more ground to Putin on the battlefield of information. Our Global Engagement Center must immediately put these funds to use, blunting the effects of Russian government disinformation. And most urgently, we need the Trump administration to finally develop a comprehensive strategy to shore up American democracy against Russian malign influence and implementing it without delay. So I'll close with this. Every day that ticks by, the Russian government burrows deeper into our society, cultivating extremists and sowing discord. Consider Alexander Torshin. NPR reported that for 6 years, he traveled to the United States to deepen his friendships with the NRA, one of the most active groups in our country. Mr. Torshin cultivated its leadership, meeting with them in Moscow. And now the FBI is reportedly investigating whether he funneled money through the NRA to support Trump's campaign. It's disturbing to think the NRA is so eager to cultivate ties with Putin's inner circle. As we all know, this organization's efforts has left our country a more dangerous place, from our schools to our movie theaters to our concerts to our churches. The American people overwhelmingly want Congress to uphold its solemn responsibility to keep our families safe. Yet the NRA's opposition to common-sense gun safety laws have made this Congress more dysfunctional and less responsive to the needs of our citizens. That, to me, Mr. President, sounds right in line with Kremlin policy. More than anything, I hope that President Trump and our Secretary of State will start treating this threat with the seriousness it deserves. They should appreciate the level of careful planning, resources, and energy the Russian government invests into destabilizing American democracy. It's time to protect the integrity of our elections and secure our democracy against the cyber threats of the 21st century, whether they come in the form of election machine tampering, or paid propaganda on social media, or targeted hacks on public officials. But in the meantime, President Trump's inaction speaks louder than his words, and his willful paralysis only serves to embolden our adversaries and weaken democratic institutions at home and abroad. That simply cannot stand, and it cannot stand with the silence we hear from too many of our colleagues on this issue. We need to speak up, we need to act, we need to make sure that the law that we pass gets enforced. Otherwise, we knew to the very essence of this institution. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, as I was walking into the chamber tonight, the press outside was telling me that they had just been told, and I hope to hear otherwise tomorrow, that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, on which the distinguished President of the Senate and I both serve, would not be holding any public hearings on the financial issues so central to holding the President of the United States accountable. So what I'm going to describe for a few minutes is how the executive branch, particularly officials such as Secretary Mnuchin, are ducking these issues, and now it appears the President's Republican allies on the Hill are ducking the issues as well. I especially believe that it is a great mistake for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, on which the distinguished President of the Senate and I both serve, to fail to follow up on the follow the money questions. Following the money, as the President of the body knows, is counterintelligence 101. Right at the heart of our duties on the Intelligence Committee is our mandate to vigorously pursue issues relating to counterintelligence. And the reason that that is so extraordinarily important, it's money which is one of the best and easiest tools to compromise people, to take advantage of counterintelligence measures that, for example, would compromise American public officials. So I believe it is a great mistake for the executive branch, particularly Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and as the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee, we have jurisdiction over his agency, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to just punt on these issues that are central to the question tonight that Senator Whitehouse deserves great credit in terms of pursuing, which is holding the President accountable. Now, the public in particular deserves the full story about financial entanglements between Russia and the president and his associates. Obviously, the American people are constantly reading stories in the press about these connections. The special counsel's indictments of Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort and campaign aide Richard Gates contain voluminous information about money laundering and tax evasion intended to hide money from pro-Russian Ukrainian entities. The distinguished president of the Senate and I know a bit about money laundering because we have introduced bipartisan legislation to deal with shell companies and money laundering. And it's clear that this is a serious matter, because when you're talking about money laundering and tax evasion, particularly as it relates to national security and American sovereignty, it has great implications. But Donald Trump and his administration have consistently tried to prevent the American people from seeing not only his finances, but the activities of Russian oligarchs. And the president's allies, both here in the Senate and elsewhere in Washington, are just going along with it. Americans need to see both sides of this. They need to understand the corruption in both Russia and in the United States in order to determine how they may be connected. That, Mr. President, is why the Congress required the administration to provide, and I want to emphasize this, a public report on the Russian oligarchs, their relationship with President Putin, and indications of corruption. But Secretary Mnuchin released nothing other than a list of rich Russians taken from public sources. So I have wanted to know if the intelligence community had warned the Secretary of Treasury against releasing what they saw as sensitive sources or methods. But when I asked the leaders of the intelligence community whether they had weighed in, they all said no. So what you have, in effect, is a whitewashing of the responsibilities of the Secretary of Treasury, possibly the White House, and possibly senior Republicans in the Congress on this issue. I then asked Secretary Mnuchin why the Russian oligarch report was covered up. I've gotten no answer to that either. This is just part of the stonewalling that is preventing the public and the Congress from following the money. Now, in addition, I have inquired to Secretary Mnuchin about Treasury documents associated with a suspicious real estate transaction in which a Russian oligarch bought an estate in Florida from Donald Trump for more than twice what the president paid for it. I've gotten no response from the Secretary on this matter either. So what you have is a period of time, and I just speak from popular news accounts, Mr. President, when President Trump bought this property, essentially did nothing with it. It was a time when it was very hard in our country to get access to money, and the president sold it to a Russian oligarch for tens of millions of dollars beyond what he paid for it. And I was particularly concerned when I read the press accounts of Florida newspapers with accountants and lawyers and others there in the Palm Beach area saying they just thought this transaction smelled. They thought it was suspicious. They thought it was questionable. They couldn't see why anybody would pay that amount on top of the purchase price without there being some more sinister kind of motive. Now, in addition to getting no response from Secretary Mnuchin on that, I have also written to Secretary Mnuchin about press reports regarding connections between the National Rifle Association and yet another Russian oligarch. And I wanted to know if there were records held by the Department of Treasury that would shine light on these reported connections. Now, Mr. President, as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, we have jurisdiction over the Department of Treasury and the work done by the Secretary and his associates. You would think that just as a matter of courtesy, Secretary Mnuchin would respond. We have received no response on that matter as well. Mr. President, I intend to pursue this matter until we get some answers. If the President, his associates, or powerful political entities like the NRA have been corrupted by Russian money, the Congress and the public need the full story. There need to be open hearings, and they need to be in the Senate Intelligence Committee. The President's associates have not been shy about releasing their side of the story, and they ought to face questions from members of Congress. And Secretary Mnuchin needs to testify about whether the Department of the Treasury knows about these financial entanglements. I'd like to close simply by saying that these questions of following the money, which I have made my top priority since the period in which the Intelligence Committee began to dig into these issues, are central to holding the President accountable. The executive branch and their allies in the Congress simply cannot justify ducking these questions, as apparently the press is about to report on the basis of conversations that I had walking into the chamber. The American people deserve to know the extent to which Russian money has corrupted their leaders and their democracy. It is long past time to open this up, and for the sake of American national security and sovereignty, get this information out. And I intend, as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee and a member of the Intelligence Committee, to stay with it until the issue of how this administration and its financial entanglements may have affected policies important to all Americans. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, as we turn to Senator Klobuchar, may I request by unanimous consent that Senator Blumenthal's legislative fellow, Mary Miller Flowers, be granted floor privileges until the end of June 2018.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I rise tonight to join my colleagues to the need to immediately respond to Russian interference. I'd like to thank Senator Whitehouse for bringing us together. This evening, many of my colleagues have spoken about how Russian aggression affects Americans and our allies across the world. Some have discussed the need for sanctions to deter Russia and the fact that the administration has not yet imposed sanctions, the same sanctions that were passed by the Senate 98-2 and 419-3 in the House of Representatives. Those were the additional sanctions that were directly related to the interference in the elections and what we saw take place over the last year. They sit dormant. Others have talked about the importance of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation and the fact that it must move forward without interference from the White House. Nearly a dozen senators have come to the floor to highlight the need to stand up to Russia. I am here to talk about the critical need to safeguard the most fundamental part of our democracy, and that is the United States elections. I heard today the Prime Minister of Sweden address our nation, standing next to the President, and he was asked a question about this. And he put it simply. He said that they believe in their country, that the people, the citizens of their country, should be the ones that makes the decisions about their elections, that they are the ones who should be able to vote, that they are the ones that should be able to have their own opinions not influenced by foreign countries acting like they are people in this country. It is you, Mr. President, that made the statement that I've quoted so many times, that in the last election it was one candidate and one party, and in the next election it could be the other candidate and the other party. We do not come here in a partisan way. We come here because the clock is ticking. Today marks an important day in the 2018 election cycle. Texas is holding the first state primary, and others begin in the coming weeks, including Illinois. Illinois, which was one of 21 states that the Russians attempted to hack into. Illinois, where they actually hacked into their voter data, the personal information about their voters. Those elections are coming. We are glad that we have a decentralized system so that they have different systems and it's harder to hack into one centralized system, but it also means that they have many things to choose from. And we have 40 states that haven't updated their equipment in over 10 years. We have 10 states that don't even have backup paper ballots, and we sit here doing nothing when the solution is right in front of us. Over the course of the last year, I have come to the floor a number of times to urge this body to take immediate action to beef up our election cybersecurity. There is no longer any doubt that our elections have been and will continue to be a target for foreign adversaries. Intelligence reports make it clear that Russia used covert cyber attacks, espionage, and harmful propaganda to attack our political system. I mentioned the attempts on 21 state election systems. You know when the real election, the general election is? It is 245 days away. 245 days away, with primaries beginning today. We have not imposed the sanctions. The administration hasn't, despite this body taking firm action that we wanted to see these sanctions. We have had 6 security heads from this administration, not the Obama administration. They already spoke out on this. This administration, the head of the CIA, the National Director of Intelligence, the head of the FBI, they all testified before the United States Senate committees that, in fact, this is happening now. And it was Director Coates, who was once a senator here, who said, in fact, he believes that the Russians are getting bolder. Getting bolder. These are not the words of the Obama security people. These are the words of the Trump security people. Last week, NSA Director Rogers said this about Russia: they haven't paid a price. At least that's sufficient to get them to change their behavior. Earlier this year, CIA Director Pompeo said that he has seen no signs that Russia has decreased its activity and that Russia is currently working to disrupt the upcoming 2018 elections. It is the policy of the United States of America to defend against and respond to threats to our nation. This is a cyber attack. It is not with bullets, it is not with tanks, it is not with aircraft, but it is an attack. It is simply using the computer system. And in every briefing that I have gone to, this is always listed as one of the major ways that foreign adversaries are going to use to attack our nation. That is, they're going to use the internet. And here we have it happening right here on our very democracy itself. In order to protect our election system, we need to do 3 key things. First, we must give state and local officials the tools and resources they need to prevent hacks and safeguard election infrastructure from foreign interference. And they need those resources now, not after the election, not after the primaries. Today, more than 40 states, as I mentioned, rely on electronic voting systems that are at least 10 years old. You think the Russians don't know that? You think I'm giving away some state secret here? Of course they know that. 10 years ago yesterday, February 6, 2008, was Super Tuesday for the 2008 presidential election. A lot has changed in the last 10 years, but not our voting equipment. It has remained the same. That is why I'm leading bipartisan legislation with Senator Lankford. This is a bipartisan effort. We also appreciate our co-sponsors, Senator Harris, Graham, Collins, and Heinrich. And we call this bill the Secure Elections Act, and it would provide $386 million in grant funding for states to secure their election system. It is paid for. We found a pay for. We have a similar bill that's led by Congressman Meadows in the House, the head of the Freedom Caucus, because they understand that freedom isn't cheap, that to guarantee freedom, that you must have a secure democracy. $386 million, that is just 3% of the cost of one aircraft carrier. I think most Americans would agree that as we see more and more sophisticated types of warfare happening, to not even pay attention to helping the states to fund this election equipment that has been woefully underfunded is a huge mistake. The second thing that we need to do, and by the way, we can do this now. We can do this on the omnibus bill. The second thing we need to do is to improve information sharing so local election officials know where they are attacked and how to respond. It took the federal government nearly a year to notify these 21 states targeted by Russian-backed hackers. That cannot happen again. Finally, we need a reliable backup system, and I'm talking here about paper backup ballots, the old-fashioned way. 10 states don't have them. The integrity of our election system is a cornerstone of our democracy. Americans have fought and died for our democracy since our country was founded, and we must guarantee that democracy continues. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The majority leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 9:30 a.m. Wednesday, March 7th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Finally, I ask that following leader remarks, the Senate resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-2155.
Without objection.
There's no further business come before the Senate. I ask it stand adjourned under the previous order, following the remarks of Senator Portman and our Democratic colleagues.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I want to join our colleagues that have spoken about the concern of the Russian cyber attacks on this country. Since every day that passes, we gather new information about how Russia, at Vladimir Putin's direction, went about interfering with using cyber attacks into this country, not only stealing names and personal information, but now about interfering in our elections. In a long indictment, the special counsel, Robert Mueller, spelled out how the so-called Internet Research Agency, which is a front in Russia, created fake accounts on social media and other internet platforms. It spread divisive content, and it even organized political rallies in the U.S. with the help of unwitting Americans, all backed by one of Putin's cronies through a so-called catering company. This indictment tells a pretty remarkable and alarming story. And if you're still not sure just what this was all about, just read the front, the Internet Research Agency's own words. Quote, "Information warfare against the United States of America." End of quote. That says it all. I know there's been a lot of discussion about Russian interference in our election, and there should be. We've got to get to the bottom of this. It's coming fast and furious, and it's going to be happening in the elections of this year. We know what Russia did in the last election, and just as the CIA director and the director of national intelligence told us, we know, in their words, that Russia will do it again. The more we learn, though, the more it becomes clear that we're not doing enough to protect ourselves from further attacks. This is not a partisan issue. It's an attack on the very foundation of our democracy. And at a time when it's getting harder and harder to come together as a country, when polarization is so rampant, when excessive partisanship is so evident, what Russia is doing is particularly sinister. They're trying to exacerbate our divisions and undermine Americans' faith in our institutions. So, months away from an election, the question is, what are we going to do about it? Just months away. Days away from an election in Texas, about 8 months away from the November general election. What are we going to do? Well, one thing that we ought to do is we ought to start defending ourselves. Last month, Senator Shaheen, Senator Blumenthal, and I wrote to the Secretary of Defense urging him to use our cyber forces, U.S. Cyber Command, which is the one instructed with protecting us, to disrupt Russian cyber operations targeting our elections. And we urge the Secretary of Defense to implement the recommendations of the Department's own task force to deter these cyber operations. That was the Department of Defense's own task force recommendations. But just a few days ago, the commander, four-star Admiral Rogers, commander of Cyber Command, told our Armed Services Committee he had still not been directed to counter these cyber operations. He needs approval from the White House. And the White House, unbelievably, hasn't authorized him to act. Until the Trump administration starts cracking down on Russia, Vladimir Putin is going to continue to get away with his cyber attacks on our elections and all of his other cyber attacks on our country. Admiral Rogers also told the committee that Russia has not paid the price for what they've done to us. That is sufficient, Admiral Rogers said, to get him to change his behavior. So this is the kind of thing, defending the nation, that our cyber forces were created for. And this senator is the ranking member of the Cyber Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. I can tell you that our cyber forces are growing and they're getting better and better, but they're only as good if they're put to work and given the task to go and defend ourselves. And so, Mr. President of the Senate, I want to ask unanimous consent that this letter that several of us sent to the Secretary of Defense be made a part of this record. And I want to take this opportunity to say that all of us have to get to work. The White House, our cyber forces, and the whole of government. When it comes to defending our democracy, many of us have taken up arms. Many of us have worn the uniform of this country to defend it. Many of us in civilian performance of the duties of this government have likewise performed duties to defend this nation. We now have to defend this nation against cyber attack, and more immediately, we have to defend against the cyber attacks to undo and undermine our democratic institutions by attacking our elections. Mr. President, I yield the floor.